Hello and welcome to another video. In this one, I'm going to show you how to add a 2D character to your cake in two ways, as a buttercream transfer and as a fondant cutout. So first of all, let's start with the buttercream transfer. I've got my characters here, Molang and Piu Piu. I wasn't familiar with them before this, but they're very cute, simple characters that are perfect for this. And if you want to give this a go yourself, I recommend starting with something like this, simple shapes that are easy to work with not too much detail. So I'm going to start with my black outline. With a piping bag fitted with a round nozzle, I'm just going to trace my outline on a piece of parchment paper that I've laid over a printout of the characters. Now the thing to remember with transfers is they'll be upside down and back to front when you're finished. Whatever you pipe first will be on the top of your transfer at the end. So if I were to do the outline last, it would be on the back of the character. After the characters have been outlined, I pop them in the freezer, and once that's firmed up, I can move on to the next step, which is piping in their pink cheeks. Again, these have to be added before anything else you want to be behind it on the final transfer, so in this case the white and the yellow backgrounds of the characters. After the pink has cooled and set, it's time for the orange of the chick, which I smooth into the crevices with a toothpick. This means that once the buttercream transfer is flipped, hopefully I won't have too many gaps and pits on the underside, which will of course become the top. Once that has set in the freezer, I move on to the backgrounds. Using a much larger nozzle, I fill them in quickly and again use a toothpick to push the buttercream into the cracks and crevices. Again, if I didn't do this, the voids would not look very good, so do take your time and just try to make it as neat as you possibly can. I smooth the top with a palette knife, and then it's time to move on to the bunny. I do the bunny in exactly the same way, just making sure to push the buttercream into the little details of its ears and feet with a toothpick. With their bases smoothed, these are going to go into the freezer until they are applied to the cake later. Now the fondant cutouts are, in my opinion, much more work, but I do think they give a cleaner look. It does depend on what you prefer though, I suppose, piping or cutting. So I start with a background colour. It's essentially the reverse of the buttercream transfer. So I roll out my white and apply vegetable shortening, Trex, to the back of my printout, which I've now cut out, so that it will stick to the fondant. Using a sharp scalpel, I cut out the shape as carefully as I can. What do you mean this looks sped up? You're sped up. What would I do? Go on the internet and lie? Once the background is good to go, it's time to work on the details. Now I've got some little circle cutters that I'm going to use to cut out the pink cheeks and black eyes. I even use the smaller cutter later on to remove a semicircle from the cheeks so the eyes will sit partly within them as per the drawing. The mouth was trickier. In fact, I messed it up the first time, but that's okay. Try again and make sure you're happy with your work. use more shortening to stick the cheeks, eyes and mouth to the background. And I prefer this to using edible glue, as you can move it around a bit when it's stuck on with shortening, whereas the glue is much tackier, so any mistakes you make are way harder to fix. With some black fondant, I roll out a few sausages and begin applying them to the mouth before using a little bit more to outline it. I debated not outlining the whole thing, but honestly I think it would have looked terrible to just leave it here, so later on I'll get out the clay extruder and do some outlining. Before that though, I have to do the chick. I repeat the process of cutting out the background, the eyes, the cheeks, and stab the fondant through the picture with my scalpel to show myself where they should be stuck. This is way easier than cutting the image up and trying to align it like I did earlier with the rabbit. Every day is a learning day. The beak is cut out of orange, and looking back I realise I never cut out its feet in orange, but I'm sure no one will notice. So a clay extruder is great for using with fondant when you want nice, even sausages of fondant. In fact, I like how neat they turn out so much better than what I did before, that I actually go back and redo the bunny's face later on, off camera. But you can do it by rolling them by hand if you don't have an extruder. In fact, I even had to get my husband to help crank this thing as it was so stiff. Once those are extruded, we can apply them to our cutouts. I just trace the lines with more of that shortening and then slowly apply little outlines, trying to make sure I don't squash them or distort the image. It's better to apply them over long and then trim back, rather than attempting to cut the fondant to just the right size on the table and then applying it. Just use a nice sharp scalpel and don't press too hard or you'll cut right through the background. I actually quite enjoyed this process. I found it almost therapeutic in a way. Either way, just carry on until the entire character is outlined. Now once the rabbit is done, I move on to working on the chick, and I think this is a better camera angle to see what I'm actually doing. I hope the changing angles aren't too distracting. We were trying something new in the hopes of getting a little bit better at this whole YouTube thing, but do let me know if it is any good. I've also started writing scripts rather than just rambling like I normally do, so I hope I sound a little bit better now. I do have a tendency to ramble when left to my own devices, so here's hoping, in the words of my sister, I yammer less. Anyway, once those have been applied, I slide the cutouts onto a baking sheet and put it in the oven at about 70 degrees Celsius for 15 minutes. You don't have to do this. In fact, leaving the fondant unbaked means it'll conform to the shape of the top of your cake more easily, but it is also more fragile and easily damaged as you move it around, so for the sake of ease, I baked mine. Now I've applied one of my buttercream transfers to the top of this cake, which I've iced earlier. I simply peeled the parchment paper back and flipped it onto the cake before I had a chance to begin melting and softening. You can use a little extra buttercream or shortening to stick it on, but mine stuck just fine after it melted a little and then went back into the fridge to firm up. I finished the cake off with a piped border and some sprinkles, and that's the buttercream transfer done. The fondant cutout goes much the same way. It peels off of the parchment much more easily and I can handle it, gently but fairly safely now that it's been baked. Again, you can stick it on with buttercream or shortening, but I do omit this here. I'd be interested to know which one you actually like better, the buttercream transfer or the fondant cutout. I know which is my favourite, but I'm curious to know what yours is. Another piped border, some more sprinkles, and that's 2 cakes topped with 2D characters made 2 ways. I hope you liked this video and found it to be informative. I had a blast making these little guys, and I hope you think they turned out as cute as I do. Please help me by dropping a like, a subscribe if you think I deserve it, and a comment. I am still pretty new to this whole thing, and it really helps my self-esteem. See you in the next one.